the thing I'd like to do is to just race through some of the thoughts about what is so seminal to our Protestant understanding of the Christian experience, still going on, but how did it begin? And that is the Reformation. And by the word itself, we can figure that there's something that's being reformed. There was a formulation. There was something that was pretty standard in the life of the church. But we're going to kind of race through what happened at a particular time. As a trained historian, one of the issues, of course, is always how does one understand history, and what does one think about the idea of history? Something a long time ago, and for many people, it is just a mystery. I don't like it. That was past. This is the present. We have to worry about the future. Why bother about what has been done? Well, every moment in time is essential and important. And of course, the great wizard of our time, the late Charles Schulz, really had it. Every moment really is essential. And when it's past, it's gone. That's it. For me, a thought about a historical view is a couple of phrases that help put in perspective. One is that if you do not know history, you are doomed to repeat it. There's too much evidence of that. Another one is the only thing that history teaches, obviously, is that history teaches us nothing because we keep making the same mistakes again and again and again. But another view, and it is primarily my attitude about history overall, is that there really is no history. It's primarily biography. It is people, not just the big names always. It is as much or often more of the, quote, lesser known people. But there are various ways to do history. And there's a great writer and journalist who clues me. He is the patron saint of all journalists, I think, because he's asking a very essential question about how you report something. And they taught me all I knew. The names, you know it perhaps, are what and why and when and how and where and who. And of course, that is Rudyard Kipling. So keeping those 6 people as a guide and at least companion as we go through is a good thing to try to keep into focus or give us some perspective. For me, the historical view of the Protestant Reformation is an event and a series of events and a great cast of characters, which, if we want to use a catchphrase, we could say the Reformation was created in Germany. It was corrected in Britain, and there are many who will tell you that it was corrupted in America, and there's a lot to argue for that. But why bother at all? I mean, there's so much of the past that we can learn from, and there's so much in the present to want to know about better, in some cases want just totally forget. You know, why deal with this as a subject at all? Not because we know nothing about it. We all know that there was a Reformation. We all know that it's part of our church history. But rather, like so many things that we hold dear, a closer look is important, and reviewing it from time to time, because attitudes about it and information about it also will change as there is more research or different points of view and different ideas that emerge. So the refining of that is important, and certainly the challenging of our ideas that old ideas often bring in, and our recharging, I guess, and energizing of what our understanding of it may have been. But the real key to, I think, wanting to know more about the history of the church overall and our particular denomination within that great family is, I think, a very important thing to do. Why? Well, the church is under enormous stress, organizationally, economically, and theologically. But when it is, I think it's all the more important that we take a look at what some things are that provide for that challenge. So for me, there is something that is helpful in knowing about the way things were, not always to go back to it, but to know what the starting point was, or how we got to this place and what it truly was. Now, for me, this invites us to ask a question about the church and its history. And for me, it is a fundamental thing that we should do every once in a while. Now, how did we get to where we are? And when did it start? And was it worthy at the time? So if we're going to go back in time, let's look at an ancient text. We often do that in the life of the church. There is some quote, often from the Bible, and this one is essential that we think about as to how and where we look back to find something of our roots. So for us, we're going back, and in that catchphrase of modern times, this is something that begins long ago and far, far away from our own day in every respect. And the journey requires us to look back, as I say, before we leap forward, and a careful look back. If we think in terms of the Christian experience, often geographically, we are focusing on the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. But it's a much larger picture than just that small piece of real estate. And it's often something that is changed at its time and continues to change today. So it's a wobbly kind of thing. You can't look at one map and have the whole story. It requires us to take a much wider view of place and people and times. And often there are a variety of ways of looking at things. I want to reduce it to just two. It's too simplified, of course. When one looks at something through a microscope, you see something that is very small, but you enlarge it, and then you extrapolate that other cells that you may be looking at in the microscope, then infer something about what is happening elsewhere. The other way, of course, to look at that is with a telescope. That brings something that's very, very far away. And again, you extrapolate by seeing something in a wide view and try to narrow it down. The map, or the territory that we're dealing with, if you look carefully at this vision, you'll see that, yes, as you focus on it, it is the North Atlantic. And you see something of the, quote, New World and the Old World. And that becomes more and more detailed after the time of Columbus. And so there's another way of taking a look at place as well as the pace of things. Seeing events in the past to get a clearer picture of the future. And here's the important part, implications for our contemporary church and society, a journey through time and place. And I'm going from east to west. Now, Janet and I used to live in New England, and that is somewhat east of here. And I know a lot about New England. In fact, you would be impressed by, I hope you would be, that I can name all of the states and the capitals of those states northeast of the Hudson River. But when you get beyond the Hudson River, then I'm a little bit more dodgy. But history in this country is often studied from the point of view of from the eastern part of the country to the west, when those of us who live here know that there is so much history that is often ignored by we snobby Easterners. And so the place is important to think about too, and the perspective that you have as a result of all of that. So time and place. And there are two words that will keep coming up, or at least they should be in the back of our minds, along with those 6 helping servants that we had to guide us along the way. From a soul concern of the human soul, just to play the pun, to a greater concern for the whole of societies. That's something that is running through the notion of the Protestant Reformation as well. So, like all important histories, this takes us from just individuals, important as that is, groups of individuals into communities, certainly collections of communities that become regions and sometimes even nations, and then continents and hemispheres, new and old. So we're going from one point in time, one place in history, and expanding this to an interconnected world. All things are connected, but the question is how and why they get connected and over what period of time. To sharpen that, let me first of all put some kind of a hodgepodge of pictures together. In these various views, let your mind just race, what on earth does that have to do with the story? I mean, what is that I'm seeing? Something that's quite contemporary, something that's old? What is that pile of stuff up there in the upper left-hand corner? And another combination here, group of individuals. None of them looked too pleased with themselves. Um, in fact, I don't think I'd want to buy a used car from any of that crowd. And then here too, something else, which you look very carefully, has one thing in common. All of them, each of them, have something to do with transportation. But we could look at that more carefully. Therefore, I want to take a look at that hodgepodge of pictures and try to date ourselves in such a way that we put into context when the Protestant Reformation really began and what was going on around it as it was evolving. So we have certainly the name of Martin Luther that we all know, maybe Ulrich Zwingli, who may be less a part of our vocabulary. Botticelli, well, at least The Birth of Venus, you saw that painting earlier. There are a variety of things, and look at the dates here. Copernicus, who so influenced Galileo, who certainly widened our view of the cosmos. Certainly an unhappy time in the life of the church, the Spanish Inquisition. Note Ferdinand and Isabella, we know something about them and their checkbook that helped to open up view to a newer world. A date, or at least an event that we all know something about, Da Vinci and the Last Supper. Another name that pops up here, Philip Melanchthon. Maybe that's a name that's familiar to you or not. Two Cabots. Out east, we would say that's a cheese manufacturer, Cabot cheese, but there are really two important explorers, father and son, who had a very, very important part in the expansion of the understanding of North America. Michelangelo, of course, the Moors in Spain, card games, and again, how people amused themselves and how they distracted themselves and whether or not the church had a view on all of that. So these are just a series of people and events within that roundabout time frame of the beginning of the Reformation, which we have not yet identified. And there's a name in the middle of this slide that is important. It is Jan Tetzel. Keep your eye on him because he was one of the key characters that Martin Luther had to contend with. So we have Erasmus or Martin Luther. We have a Medici, one of that great family of Italian minds who were so wealthy and provided so much of an advance in science and education, and also a narrowness in the focus of the church about the time of the Reformation as well. And the last thing, if this is getting too boring, coffee has been invented, or at least it's come to Europe. So that's an important thing to remind you of too. So again, this hodgepodge of pictures just to provide some kind of a setting, not to identify the date in a solid and clear and exclusive way, but rather to say there are a whole lot of things going on in Europe and in various parts of the world at the time of the beginning of the Reformation, and who some of these characters were and how they were connected back and forth with one another. The age of the Reformation from the Common Era, 1517, to about 1600 would be that the essence of the time. But there's not one Reformation, there are two. I mean, you always get more than you pay for in the life of the Christian church. So you came thinking there would be one. Well, I want to argue for two. One was, of course, the Protestant Reformation, and it begins with a very particular time and event. If you have to have one to mark it, that would be October the 31st, 1517. If history took a turn at every point in time when historians argue that this was a turning point in history, you'd have a much greater labyrinth, I think, than we do even today. But this would be one of those times that you could mark that things really did change. This is a marker for us. But there's also another Reformation, a response to that, but something that even began to fester before that date. So you have the Protestant Reformation itself, and you have the Roman Catholic response to and its own attempts at reforming itself. An age of Reformation, sandwiched between 2 or 3 or 4 other periods of time, and they would be names that we all know, but often not so clear that we can identify immediately as to what the time frame or what the key events might have been. Renaissance and, of course, Enlightenment. I'm looking at a period of time which is vast, about 850 years. That's a long period of time that formulated and was something that the fermentation as well as the fermentation of Protestant Christian thought evolves from. 4 overlapping periods of time: the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and of course, continuing on. 2 keywords for each of these, not to reduce it, but to have something that we can peg other thoughts onto, some placeholder. The Middle Ages might be summarized as being a time of fear and superstition. We still have that today, of course, but that would be something that was so overwhelmingly a focus of that period of time. The Renaissance, you could say, was a time of greater inquiry and tolerance. For the first time, people were looking at other people's and seeing something that they wanted to know about them that might advance them themselves. The Reformation, faith and conformity would be the 2 words that I would use to summarize that. Again, far too general, but it is an opportunity to give us some focus. And the Enlightenment, we could say something about reason and knowledge. So these 2 words for each, if you're trying to find some way to summarize it. But then again, I would reduce all of that to 2 other words. And this does provide, I think, some very key focus for us. The core of that would be how these relate to one another. These 2 words are important, essential. They may not have the same power that they had years ago, but they are still important and were basic back in those days. The 2 words are, drum roll, please. Thank you. Soul and society. Fairly simple words that we know, but how they are to be understood is really the key. So soul and society, they all come into play again and again and again as we think about the Protestant Reformation. There are other words as well. Some students who did this survey with me found all kinds of things in the Reformation that deal with these words, each of which begins with the letter S. But we digress. The Protestant Reformation begins, I gave you the date, October the 31st, 1517. It may have started innocently enough, but it was a noisy beginning, even if it began with nothing less than a quick start, and some people were not looking, some people were not listening, but as soon as the race had begun, they could not avoid it. And what evolved was not just a new attitude of the church, it could be the marker for the whole beginning of the, quote, modern age. So let us begin with an ancient text again. The righteousness of God has been clarified apart from the law. That would be the understanding of the law and the prophets in the Bible. Although the law and the prophets give witness to it, the righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Now, that's a quote that you want to keep in the back of your memory because it will affect what the Protestant Reformation becomes. So on that night of October the 31st, the eve of All Saints' Day, we call it Halloween in this country, Martin Luther, with the tapping of his little attack hammer, posted 95 theses, that is, issues that he wanted to discuss or debate with other scholars of the church. Interesting. The church in those days, the front door was kind of the community bulletin board. And if you had some notice that you wanted people to be apprised of, you posted it on the door of the church. And here, quite innocently, Luther did something very common. He put up this notice that he had these 95, he didn't do things in a small way, issues that he wanted to argue, not what was right or wrong, but let's get to what people think about these various things. And that was these this listing of 95 theses. Innocent enough, very parochial, but then again, at a particular time, at an age when, and a time when popes, princes, priests, and countless poor would be what the real estate looked like. An age of ghosts and goblins, and not just on one Halloween night, but people really believed in the power of physical and actual evil spirits and beings. Evil spirits lurked everywhere, and these were frightening and overpowering in every community. And so we see this again and again and again. Now it was the time of a very real notion of the devil, the incarnation of evil par excellence. But you had two devils to choose from. You had the one that is lurking here in this view in the background, and then you have another one, and he's pictured here, Martin Luther. So you had two devils to choose from. But another way to think about it would be Martin Luther was the devil himself, if you're on one side of the issue, but there's another one, and he is a Medici, very wealthy. He becomes Pope Leo X, and he is building St. Peter's, and he's doing a great many things, and he is very focused on how wonderful the church is and how much more magnificent it's going to be, and many people saw him as a devil who was so focused on things and not people that it was indeed dismaying to them. And so you had two devils to argue with. Martin Luther, Roman Catholic parish priest, professor of heretic theology. His views were not appreciated, and Pope Leo X. Martin Luther, born in Bonn, Germany, was a figure in time, and we have to place this before 1492. That may give us some reference. He was educated in a local church school, and his education was typical of many, but very, very hard and harsh. He called it purgatory and hell itself because he was brutally beaten and much abused, as many students were. Boys only, by the way, but trained in three particular areas, as everyone was: the classic trivium of grammar, Latin, and rhetoric, and how to put a good sentence and idea together and verbalize it. Very good training for what would become the great debates of his age. Because of his views on the church, because of his arguments about why things are as they are, or why shouldn't they be otherwise, he was challenged by the church, and there was a great debate. It was called the Diet at Worms. That didn't mean he had to eat worms, but for some it may be equally distasteful. It was a trial, a debate, where he was given the opportunity to put his ideas before the teachings of the church and have them argued. On the lower right-hand side of this painting, you see a person who is with a pen in his hand, just at the very edge on the right-hand side. And you see taking down all the notes, the secretary. It's important that we note this because the most important phrase that came out of this particular event was not written down. In fact, everyone agrees that it was said, but it was so shocking that even the secretary couldn't bring himself to write it down, because Luther was asked, can you prove that your differences with the church have some foundation? And Luther said, here I stand. I can do no other. Stand where? On the Bible. If you can show me in the Bible anything that I have said or done that is wrong, then I will recant. Otherwise, I go with my own view. So I guess at the time of Shakespeare as well, even the devil can quote scripture for his own purpose. There's a great deal in there, and Luther wanted to stand on that. But he sought salvation in biblical studies for a very important reason. He did indeed find that his education was important, but the church's view of what one should be was even more dominant, and two particular matters of personal salvation. unquestioning discipline in the light of the church, pious acts of prayer, and continual suffering, and endless self-sacrifice. That's what the church asked of its leadership. That's what it asked of its priests. But Luther said there is more to it than that. Yes, personal pain does have its place in the life of the church at that time, they argued. Suffering, too, has its place. Corruption and abuses in the church were, as they would be in every society, were well known, but often just put aside. What were they? Well, previous attempts at reform. Luther was not the first one to do this. John Wycliffe was one great reformer 100 years before. William Tyndale, a name that you may know. Hugh Latimer, another one. And of course, John Huss had also made many of the same arguments that Luther put forward, but they never really took the same kind of traction and hold. Luther's view, spiritual force and intellectual arguments, another reason why the Reformation was not only successful, but spread rapidly. And why is that? A remarkable invention, or the development of one that had been around for a long while, came to pass, and that was the printing press. So that the things that Luther and others were saying and arguing were now not only written down, they were being Xeroxed and emailed and sent around the world. So we have the opportunity to celebrate Johann Gutenberg and his first printing press, at least in a practical way, in Europe. Janet and I had an opportunity to view this at very close hand. You can hear, you know, at the Huntington, there is a Gutenberg Bible. We were in New Haven a couple of years ago, and there are two Gutenberg Bibles there at the University of Yale, and for a variety of reasons, it was out of its cage, and we were invited to thumb through it, and it was a really thrill to be able to be that close to something which is so remarkable. So corruption and abuses were a part of the church, as they are a part of every great society, but this was not the major issue. But what were those abuses? Well, there were three. One was the issue of simony. In those days, you could buy a church office. Why? Because if you were a high mucky muck in the church, you could get other people to do things for you, and there was a great deal of money that you could extract from them, so that had power. So the buying of a church office was common. Scandalous, but it was common. Indulgences. I mentioned Tetzel earlier. You could buy forgiveness, not just for yourself, but for your departed relatives who are off somewhere in purgatory, whether they're going to heaven or to the mythical hell. If you give us a gift, the church is saying, we'll make sure that they move in the right direction. And here's Tetzel himself trying to sell his indulgences. And also the blind veneration of sacred relics. There were enough pieces of bone, it was said, to host a whole other army. Maybe enough sticks and opportunities to see pieces of the one true cross that, if all put together, would build a cathedral. So that was a very troublesome time. But it was still not the thing that fired the Protestant Reformation. It was less what people thought about the Pope or about attitudes in the church. Rather, it was the affirmation of the writings of St. Paul. And we already have one of those quotes before us. And again, it is, the righteousness of God has been clarified apart from the law, although the law and the prophets give witness to it. The righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. The point is that we are justified, or we live, or our goal is to live in faith and trust. Faith in the power and relevance of the life and teachings of Jesus. You don't have to do a pile of good works. You don't have to give a lot of money. You don't have to do a variety of things that the church was arguing for at the time. Rather, it's not the pretensions of piety. It is rather through the occasional letters of Paul, that Luther came to see something that was quite remarkable, something that he had read many times, I'm sure, but all of a sudden it makes sense in a new way, that God loves us because of our worth, or whatever work we may be trying to do to become worthy of God's love. That was the prevailing view. But no, it's the other way around. And Luther pointed this out, as others had as well. But now with the printing press to back him up, and this word is spread around to many, many more people, it is that God loves us already and shows us in 100 different ways every day of our lives. So it's the reverse of this idea. God loves us already. Luther saw this passage because he could read the Bible and understood this in a new way for the first time, but it was a lightning bolt to him, that God loves us not because we have any worth or because there are some people who are more worthy than others, but rather that we already have worth because God's love is for everyone. We have worth because of God's love. Luther learned this lesson because the church insisted that this was something that all of the priests know, at least how to read the Bible, but Luther wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible, and not just in a frozen Latin, but in their own language. So translated it into German so that people could more easily read it. So this became the first and central tenet of Protestant theology. Every person should be able to read the Bible in one's own language and be able to think about it and discuss it among themselves. Therefore, no need for priests just to tell us the very foundation of our faith. Every believer could be one's own priest in that sense. Thus, the priesthood of all believers. Now, that too is a phrase that is identified with the Protestant Reformation, a priesthood of all believers, which the function of which would be not merely to minister to themselves, but to one another. Of course, especially trained and perhaps ordained ministry to exercise certain priestly functions, but such persons would represent and inspirit the priesthood of all. Such persons, women as well as men, of course, would be chosen by a community and not just imposed upon them. All of these ideas of Luther and the other reformers of the day. Two main points then of the Protestant Reformation: justification by faith, faith in Jesus Christ, and also the notion of the priesthood of all. We can all minister to one another. And so there is more to tell. It's a long and involved and much convoluted story. Certainly we can assume that by the long period of time that it covers. And there are other personalities, I was arguing for biography, who are, of course, a part of this ongoing story. Zwingli and Calvin and Knox, Luther of Russia, Byron, Cromwell, Robinson, Williams, Whitefield, brothers Tennant, all matter of New England mothers, and Jonathan Edwards, and more. But the essence of the argument is, I think, that though there were many corruptions in the church of the day, it is not just the matter of simony or selling of indulgences or abuses of sacred relics. This is what Luther protested against, to be sure. But more importantly and essentially, justification by faith and a priesthood of all believers. This is really the argument for the Protestant Reformation. I lived in East Africa for some time, and I was often asked by people there, are you a Christian or a Protestant? And this, I think, helps me to put myself into a better state with all of that. It is a for testimony. This is what the Protestant church is all about. Yes, there are some things we are against, but far more we are for something. What we are for and what we are against. Each year on the hallowed eve of Halloween in this country, as we celebrated, or at least endured about a week ago, ghosts and goblins to be sure. But they are just remnants of medieval days. We remember the freedom that we have beyond these historic and somewhat fanciful symbols. To recall and to live in light of a God who loves us not because of who we may be or think we must become, but in spite of ourselves, one who loves us unendingly. And as Paul also says in Corinthians 13, that love never ends. And so this story and the enactment of the Protestant Reformation continues. And though it may have been created in Germany, corrected in England, and yes, many would argue corrupted in America, well, there is more to tell later and maybe in a better time. But for today, thank you very much for allowing me the time. And are there any questions, corrections, or comments that you would offer? I would be happy to know some of your responses. Please tell me. Good, I can go. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you.
You know, part of biography, sociology, psychology. I'm interested in some of the challenges of the church today, understood through this great tradition.
All right, let me rephrase that, just to repeat it, because I think that some of our those who have joined us online may not be able to hear exactly what you're saying. You're wanting to know something more about, or make the point that there are personalities in today's life of today's church that.
Well, 200 years ago, the most important thing was your economic class, whether you're working class or middle class. More recent times in our own lives, it may be the family life. Now it's the individual. That makes a huge difference in how you latch onto your faith, whether you're individual, whether you have a social conscience, whether you have a feeling for the gloriousness of the universe.
So who you were at one time, yeah.
Compassion.
Yes, who you were gave you so much status in the past, and now we're trying to look more carefully at each individual, not only who you are, but each individual is worthy and should be viewed as an individual and not just as part of a larger class of persons.
I've been a Protestant all my life and still am, but I admire the Roman Catholic reliance on faith, on understanding, as well as the literalism of the Bible, and through hermeneutics and other ways we have adopted that without acknowledging.
I agree that we're taking a more inclusive view now than we once did about not just one particular belief, but trying to understand a great many different points of view. And an important thing that we've become, I think you're quite right, more inclusive, not only in particular matters, but in the general of wanting to see that there is worth in many places. And if there is something that is worthy in other places, what might it be and how can we benefit from best practices and that sort of thing? Other questions?
Ron?
I hear a voice that is calling and I can't see who it is, but please identify yourself and ask the question.
Hey, Ron, Rich Luma.
Ron.
Old Pilgrim
Rich
Place.
Luma from Pilgrim Place, I think.
Yeah, there you got it. You know, Henry left the church because he wanted to divorce his queen.
Can you hear what Rich Luma is saying? Yes, right. So go ahead, Rich. Sorry, we can hear you.
So in what sense was that a correction of the Reformation?
Good point. Henry the Eighth of England wanted very much to have greater control over the life of the church, because when he asked to divorce his first wife, one had to get permission to do so, particularly for a king. And the church would not allow that divorce. The church said no, and Henry said, wrong answer. And it was, of course, the Church of Rome. And so Henry said, it is now the Church of England, thank you very much. And so he said that now I have all the power and control over the life of the church in Britain, and we will no longer look to Rome for instruction. I will provide you all the information that you need. Better still, I will appoint the bishops of my church, and not just from Rome. So there was both a personal and a political arrogance there in his role.
Got it.
How's that a correction? How is that a correction?
How is that? I think that's Natalie Cyrus who's asking.
It is, yes, yeah, because that was the second part of Rich's question, corrected by England.
From their point of view, to be sure. It wasn't just enough in Europe, but we will take our own view of it. We will look away from the Roman view of the church and even how it has evolved throughout Europe. We will give our own British and English spin to it. And this is how it is not enough of a Reformation just in England, just in Europe. We have more to do and say. And so we will control not only the theology, but the economics as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Ron.
Welcome indeed. Another question.
Ron, this is Mel Boynton.
Yes, Mel.
Excellent talk. You could stop your screen share if you want to see the people on the Zoom. I put a question in the chat, and it's really, I've always been struck by the light and the dark of characters in our history. And Martin Luther, of course, was such a contributor to our faith journey as a church, but he was terribly anti-Semitic. And he had a 1543 treatise called The Jews and Their Lies. And it was a 65,000 word treatise calling for destruction of synagogues and stripping of rabbis of their preaching authority and taking money and stopping their schools. It was just a horrible anti-Semitic rant. What do you make of that?
Thank you, Mel. Mel Boynton is pointing out the fact that one of the things that, I'm going to get some help with the screen share. Thank you. Mel, hold on just a moment. We're trying to correct for my, I think I'm there.
You're there.
The brutally anti-Semitic statements of, and perhaps a essential belief of Martin Luther, a great shame for us today. It is true. And we can make this parallel with so many great figures whom we have admired and did impressive things in so many ways, also have a regrettable and dark side. I mean, we've certainly gone through this, and we're still going through this in the notion of racism in our own country as we look at some of our most heroic characters, Jefferson to be sure, George Washington, and others who had were slavers and the rest of it. Yes, more to the point with Luther. It is true. He was a man of his time, and this was the prevailing view within the church at that day. Luther did not overcome this, but his successors eventually did. So we must give Luther, I think, credit for the fact that he opened the way that others would come in and continue this notion of reforming of the church and re-looking at attitudes so there could be a wider discussion. I do not give him credit for it all. I think he unlocked the door, opened it, and then new ideas came through. So it's one of the things that we have to regret about many great people, that they were not perfect and that they did horrible things. And how we can weigh their worth in light of that is something that everybody has to wrestle with in the greater context. Another question, please.
Just a clarification.
We have a question from here.
Luther was so excited about salvation through faith that he thought that this is such a wonderful truth and liberating thing that it would affect the Jews too. And as he got older and crankier, he overreacted against the Jews because they hadn't converted.
The question is about whether or not he was had a fair assessment of what the powers of Christianity might have with and over against the notion of Judaism. Yes, too, a man of his time, still great conflicts within the overall church, not only with the notion of Islam and Jews, but with anything that would be different from the prevailing Christian view. So again, he unlocked the door, other people walked through it. Many of these arguments and fights are still going on, but the fact that we have a church which will not only allow, but in the Protestant sense, I hope, an encouragement that such discussions can go on is a very, very good and advancing thing. Not all the problems are solved. They still certainly aren't today, but there is a way of discussion and debate that allows for better ideas to emerge. And that is, I think, a very good thing and a very Protestant idea. Others? Well, you're very tolerant to allow me to come and try to cram much too much information into one rapid view. But in summary, I would say that the notion of the Protestant Reformation is something that all of us should have some understanding of and give appreciation to for a high watermark in the whole of the Christian story. And it is something that those of us who tend to rely ourselves on this side of the Reformation should know more about, because it does raise wonderful questions that we should continue to engage and discuss. And I'm grateful for an opportunity to be able to do that here. Service will begin in about 7 minutes, and we can really celebrate all of this. Thank you very much indeed.